Benchmark Business Sales and Valuations proudly presents the Meaning Business Podcast, hosted by Coudrey and Peter Spinda. This is the podcast for anyone serious about buying, selling, and preparing your business for maximum growth.
Welcome to Meaning Business, the podcast from Benchmark Business Sales and Valuations for business owners, business people looking to buy a business or sell a business. We talk about what it's like to own a business, and in this case, we're going to talk about what it's like to have your business valued and business valuation. So with me today, I've got Peter Spinda. Welcome, Pete.
Thanks again, Bruce.
And we've got a special guest all the way from Sydney, New South Wales, sitting in a bar, Steve Wray, who... if anyone's a business broker or business valuer in Australia, they probably know who Steve Wray is, but welcome, Steve.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's kick off. We want to talk today just a little bit about business valuation generally, Steve, and I don't think there's too many other people in Australia who would be as well qualified in across the spectrum of not just business valuation, but buying and selling businesses as you. So I really appreciate you giving us some time to have a chat to us today.
All good, Bruce.
How long you been doing business valuations for, and how many you done, and how you got into it, and why you got into it, and why do you like it?
Look, I got into business broking very young, and I was one of the youngest in Sydney, and I had a very, very good concept of valuation. I spoke to valuers every day, and it annoyed me because I was so young that no one would take me seriously. So once the grey hairs started coming and people did start taking me seriously, I absolutely enjoyed it. But, I think I counted yesterday after you asked me, and I've valued over 130 different business types.
Business types, so not individual businesses, business types.
No, business types.
Yeah. Wow.
Anywhere from, accountancy, air conditioning, arborists, down to the W's, wholesale, tools, window manufacturing, workwear stores, everything in between.
Mm.
And so you've mentioned you started as a business broker. So when I first met you, you were, I think you were selling news agencies with a guy named Rumsey Mina, is that right?
Yeah. So look, my family were news agents originally. So I grew up in news agencies. At 17, I was a locum. So throughout New South Wales for news agents that would go on extended holidays. So I was running businesses for them. They would pack up their family, go on a 2-month holiday, and I'd move in and take over their business and keep it running while they were on holidays, which was hard for a news agent. 3 a.m. start. A lot of them were finishing at 7 at night. It was 7 days a week.
Yeah.
So, in my early my late teens rather, that was a big responsibility, but it also got you, to learn how to run small business. My specialty is small business, and that's the background.
And that's the hardest stuff to value, I think, because larger businesses are easy to value, or relatively, I guess, because you've got stock market and other public information available, but small businesses are unique. Often a lot of the IP and the goodwill is invested in the owner and that sort of stuff. So it's probably more tricky, Steve.
Documentation as well, as you know, Bruce. The small businesses, it's getting better. They've got to do BAS returns and they've got to keep some records. Go back to the 80s, there were no records.
Yeah.
It's a different animal, and from a valuation point of view, it can be very, very difficult when there's no documentation there.
So just sticking with the good old days, so news agencies were considered to be like a premium business, weren't they? I think they were selling at 4 or 5 times EBITDA. Is that right?
Well, they were actually selling anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 PBITA, but it wasn't the current PBITA. So PBITA for your listeners is earnings to one proprietor working full time.
Mm.
what profit's left to that one proprietor? News agencies used to sell on the basis of two proprietors working 110 hours a week. What was left to them? And it was anywhere from 2.5 up to 3.5 times EBITDA plus equipment.
You're right.
Plus stock. So, the multiples in today's sort of methodology is, probably around that 5 or 6 times multiple.
Yeah.
Retiring Commonwealth Bank manager or Westpac, it was the Bank of New South Wales in those days. Every retiring manager went out and bought a news agency.
And they were, one of the reasons why they were perceived to be such a great business was they had a prescribed area, right? So no one else could sort of tread on your area. Is that right?
Yeah, the prescribed area, you could either make it big in that area. You had the opportunity to open other venues, other shops. Yeah. And look, in the context of, today's business, we're going to talk about, what drives value, but having exclusive rights to a product or an exclusive area drives value in a business.
Yeah, that hasn't really changed. It's just that, so what has changed with news agencies? Why aren't they as popular now? Why aren't they as valuable?
Look, there's a couple of things. One is people don't want to work 7 days anymore. There are less people going into business as a family. So as a husband and wife, to work full-time, to work 7 days, there's a lot more time. So a 5-day cafe is worth more than a 7-day cafe.
There's another part of it, Steve, that, a lot of the young generation, my kids, they don't want to work in business. They can get a job working in a hospital for, 6 figures plus a year, pretty good, or a council or something.
So what would you take on that sort of responsibility? Do you think that there's also more of an entrepreneurial culture where we say, okay, well, as a business owner, you're in a job, like you said, with the news agency, but when it's the entrepreneurial culture, it's about, okay, well, me building up an organization so that eventually I don't have to work in that. I can put in managers. I want to grow. I want more.
Yeah, they didn't typically. And again, with everything we do, it's generalizing because every business is different. Every owner's motivation is different. Buyers' motivations are different. But typically it was buying a good job. It was buying secure income for their family. And I came into it during the 80s when we had the high interest rates of 16 and 18%. So people were looking for stability and a safe business. Yeah. So, that's where I sort of started in that really grassroots type of business.
That's interesting. And so, and like you said before, we're going to talk about what makes, what builds value, what gives a business value. But it's interesting then that in terms of that sense, the entrepreneur sees value in the future in terms of the potential opportunity where they could take it, which is quite intangible. And then we've got, like you said, the tangible where we have the equipment, we have the stock, and we have the customers and the exclusivity from a licensing perspective.
Yeah, and look, what has changed is there is a perception, in all business, buyers will pay more for what they perceive as going to be a good business going into the future. Whether that's reality or not is a separate thing. So once buyers lost, once the news agencies themselves lost their exclusive areas, the instant buyer perception was the business wasn't as good as it used to be. In some cases, that was not right. The businesses were actually selling, less of the low profit margin items. So they were dumping the newspapers and the magazines and then selling more gifts and more cards and higher valued items. Their profit, in some cases, stayed the same or went up. The perception is that industry is dead.
Absolutely. We don't find bank managers buying them now.
They started cutting the shop size back to smaller shops to save on rent, and the downward spiral, became worse.
There's an interesting documentary, random tidbit of thing that I watched the other night, and it was about typewriters. And many years ago, about 10 years ago, there was a newspaper article that went out that said something along the lines of the last typewriter manufacturer in India has shut their doors. And then they actually interviewed a gentleman who owns a typewriter manufacturer. And he says, well, that's the perception. We still manufacture typewriters. And he was showing on the TV in the interview that here's the type of product we manufacture, and what's happened is that the industry's evolved. So like you're saying, evolution happens and the model changes but they're still around. So it's the perception.
We use news agencies as a bit of a base when we talk about small business, because everyone knows what one was. Everyone was a news agency in the old days. So, the themes cut across a lot of small businesses and a lot of industries.
So let's talk about that. When someone comes to you and you've got a job to value a business, where do you start? What do you look at? How does it work? What are you looking for? How do you value a business?
Most people assume the place I start's at a calculator and asking for some numbers, but the purpose of valuation is the most important starting point. Why are you getting done? Are you getting it done for the purpose of selling? And the process, all business valuation has a process. The process involves various techniques, various methods, scientifically proven methods. But the purpose of valuation will change how you apply those methods and standards.
Why is that?
So let me just use an example. If someone was looking at selling a small business and they didn't have a lease, it would be very reasonable upon the valuer to put a special assumption on their valuation to say, I valued it at X dollars, and I've made a special assumption that a purchaser would get a new lease. And here's the value on the basis of the new lease. So that would be reasonable because in a sale, they're either going to get it or not get it. But if it was for a family law matter or a litigation matter, we can't just instantly make that special assumption. We don't know the landlord. We don't know the background. We have to rely on what the facts are. And the facts are there may be 6 months left on the lease.
So the purpose affects it.
So the purpose affects the value itself.
So getting deeper into it, once you've established what the purpose is, what are you sort of looking at then? How do you go forward?
Yeah, so again, most people assume that I just pick up the calculator.
You actually have a real calculator.
So look, we've got to look at both the qualitative and the quantitative parts of the business. So, qualitative, that is all those numbers. What is happening with the trade? Is sales going or revenue going up? How's the gross profit percentages? Is it within industry, recognised standards or benchmarks? How's the profitability? And obviously, we've got to look at not necessarily the profitability that's on their tax returns and what they're telling me, how it's been adjusted for their personal structure, but normalising those figures back to what a buyer would achieve under running that business. So that's the quantitative aspects of the business, the numbers side, looking at customer bases and whether the business has got a customer bringing in 90% of the revenue. That would increase risk. And then the qualitative side of the business is the lease, for example. Is the rent above market? Is the rent, how long is the lease? Is there a demolition clause in the lease? Looking at what's happening in that area. Is it about to be reclaimed? Is it on a main road? Is the town shifting from this side of the town to another part of the town? So looking at all those qualitative areas on everything, whether it go through staffing, is there a key person, a key staff member? If you lost them, you would lose all the knowledge in the business. So
you start understanding the business from a financial and a non-financial point of view. You start trying to get all the data that you can on how the business works and what's going to affect the business probably into the future. Steve, is that what you look at as well?
Yeah.
So having done that, and you must have a process to do that, you must have developed systems and processes, checklists to do that. Do you then figure out what's the methodology to apply?
Yeah, so look, in all business valuation, there's three approaches to value. So you've got the asset approach or cost approach, you've got an income approach, and you've got a market approach. And our expertise, having sold businesses, and the international valuation standards direct you where possible to always use a market approach. And our expertise as business brokers is we understand the market, we have access to market evidence, and that's majority, not all valuations, but that is the most reliable form for typically what we do.
Yeah. So I'm going to deviate for a second. We'll come back to the small business valuation stuff in a minute. But why do you think it is, Steve, that on the stock market you can get public companies that are making no profit? They're so highly valued. And how does that reconcile with small businesses that are making no money?
It doesn't reconcile, all the time.
Yeah.
But I'll use the example. Instagram sold at the time for $1 billion, and it was pre-revenue.
Yeah.
But what was the motivation of the buyer? The motivation of the buyer was Facebook knew their customer base was aging, and the younger generation were not using Facebook. They were moving across to Instagram. So to save essentially their business, they needed to invest in new technology or invest, sideways move to pick up younger users. And they paid $1 billion for something that hadn't, pre-revenue.
So you could argue that's strategic value.
With that, exactly.
So there's more than one type of value, isn't there? It's not just like market value or business value.
Touch or feel.
Yeah.
It gets back to what was the purpose of that, if you were valuing that, what was the purpose of that? That was a strategic acquisition, and there were strategic benefits to the purchaser. So the value, if you were valuing it, and I certainly wouldn't be putting my hand up to look at anything like that, but you'd be looking at that on a totally different basis. You're looking at what are all those users going to do to our existing business, and how can revenue increase on our existing business, and what do we think it's worth, to us.
So for the small business owner, in terms of, what does this mean for them? Does this mean, Steve, that if I start thinking about my business holistically across all the different facets, and I could showcase or uncover different forms of value that are hidden? So potentially, let's say I'm an accountant and I have 2,000 businesses on my books. That's value. And if I can showcase that and bring that to the front, is that where it could fit in, where the small business owner could leverage the non-tangible type of things in their business?
Yeah, look, using the accountant as an example, he's got 2,000 clients on his books. What a purchaser would look at is what type of clients are on your books. So, for example, 2,000 clients that just do a tax return every year is less valuable than 2,000 clients that are mid-sized businesses bringing in $30,000 revenue a year, or super funds or family trusts, which bring in a higher sort of fee base. So the value in accountancy firms really come down to the type of client base they've got and the mix of clients.
What about the opportunity component? So if you say 2,000 clients as an accounting firm and they're just doing the base sort of services, could you not extrapolate and say, well, there's an opportunity to upsell to these 2,000 by prospective new owner if they've got the ability to provide services? So there's the value? Yeah,
look, there is, and using that example, there is really good market evidence out there. So there are a lot of accountancy practices get sold every year. A lot of them are acquired and merged into bigger entities. So there is market evidence for these different types of customer bases. And the trick with market evidence, it takes into account, in that particular example, the possible upside of converting a smaller client to a larger client. The evidence, the market's the market in that particular case. But, getting back to, other businesses, and I'll use childcare, for example, when the big childcare companies are acquiring, and as Bruce said, they're listed on, the ASX, they're trading at, 15 and 16 and, higher multiples. Well, when they've got a strategic acquisition in mind, they're looking for an area where possibly they don't have a footprint. And they may be willing to pay a higher multiple for the business. Now, does that mean that your business is not worth, it is worth 6 times? Well, you might get a 6 times sale if that particular strategic buyer wants your business in that location. If they don't want it, you're at market value.
Yeah.
So again, back to the purpose, if I was valuing it on a sale purpose, I would probably give 2 ranges based on the market is this, the evidence is this. However, we know there's evidence that strategic buyers are paying a higher multiple. If you were, in that area where the strategic purchaser wanted you, you would probably achieve something like this.
So a lot of what we talk about with value is multiples of earnings, multiple of profit, multiple of EBITDA or PBITDA, right, Steve? Yeah. Is it possible for a small business that's making no profit to still be valued and have value? And could you assess a value of a business that's making no profit?
Yeah. The smaller the profit, the harder it is to value businesses. But yeah, so, and while we're on childcare, I was chatting to a valuer yesterday, and it's a startup. So it's a brand new childcare centre, the lease is in place, the building's been built, it's ready to open. That has value. It's no revenue, it's pre-revenue.
Yeah.
In that particular example, what would affect value? Well, what's the surrounding area like? What are all the competitors? How are they trading? Are they trading full? Have they got waiting lists? Or are they trading, at 80% and there's no waiting list? So that would affect value of the new unopened centre. Is the new unopened centre ready to start trading today, or is there still more council approvals, which may be 12 months down the track, and the market can change within now to 12 months. So that's in that example. But other businesses, Bruce, that are pre-revenue, pick a transport company. They might have, 10 trucks. They might have a couple of $1 million worth of trucks, and it's pre-revenue. So the asset itself has value. The customer base.
And I think what you refer to quite often is the market is the market. So what is the market doing? So, for example, with printing businesses, the market has sort of evolved into a sort of process where how they value print companies, right?
Yeah, so if you're valuing a printing business, you would look at, you'd value, well, again, get back to the purpose of it. If it was for litigation or something, you'd be valuing it purely on one way. But if you're valuing it for sale, you'd look at the evidence on what printing businesses are selling. It might be a multiple of EBITDA. You would certainly look at what the equipment is worth, because, they typically hold, large amounts of capital equipment. And there is plenty of evidence out there that they typically can be split. And we sell off the equipment to one client and the customer base to a client that's already got capacity in their existing business. So they've got a factory, they've got the staff, they've got the machinery, and they've got spare time and capacity to bring on these new clients. So it's worth money to them, to buy this customer base of a failing printing business and plug it in. And from a valuer's point of view, there is evidence to what price people would pay for that customer base.
So I've got two quick questions that I just wanted to ask you. One was, so we mentioned that you value if you're, say, a litigation, family matter, for example, and then the other one you mentioned is when we're looking at selling a business. Are there any other times that you'd get a valuation? So if I've got a successful business right now, I've got no issues, no litigation, and I don't want to sell, is there a value or a benefit for me seeking a valuation?
Yeah, look, I've got a number of clients that every couple of years we'll do another valuation. They're growing their business. They've got an exit plan or a timing of an exit plan, and we'll assess the business every couple of years to whether they're on track. And one of the tricky ones is revenue's growing, profits growing, but it's all coming from one of the clients. So all of a sudden their client base has gone from their biggest client being 40% to their biggest client now being 80%. Now, is that a bad thing? Well,
it's interesting, yeah.
Not necessarily, because your profit's up, revenue's up, business is growing, and you're not going to turn away that number one customer. But that's the type of advice we can give them to, looking at that, how that's going to be, viewed in the marketplace.
Interesting. And then so the second question that I had was, what is an evaluation report? So obviously, purpose of the valuation is to get a figure, but what's in the report?
So again, so typically in a report, different valuers put different things in there, but it starts off with what was the instructions. So we're always instructed, and a report is a bit more robust than a basic appraisal. There's a legal framework around it. So the reporter will explain in detail what we're asked to do, what we've done, what evidence we relied on. So the report will cover exactly what documentation, what evidence, what assumptions we had to make, if there were any special assumptions. So they're all listed. And then it goes through the various analysis, the qualitative and quantitative, and looking at the economy and the industry itself. So we spoke about news agencies. You would look at the industry itself, what is changing, what regulations, liquor law regulations changing, service stations, what's happening with the industry itself.
So it sounds like it's a pretty robust tool then. In fact, it's not just about the number, but it can give me advice and guidance, and it's like, market research, everything, competitor research combined in one neat little document.
Yeah, and look, the number is sometimes the easier part, especially for experienced valuers who are, around the market every day. So the number itself can be the easier part, but it's just making sure you consider all those important factors. And we see a lot of rushed appraisals or valuations that fail to pick up all those important considerations.
Sorry, I'm just stuck on one thing that I find really interesting, which you mentioned just then, where you're in a business, revenue's growing, profits growing, and so the assumption is that the value of the business is growing, but in fact, analysis highlights that, hang on a second, the revenues because you won more work from one client, and therefore you've gone from 40% to 80%. So that's really interesting. And what's interesting for me is that wouldn't probably come out of an accountant's analysis. The accountant probably wouldn't tell me about that, would they? In their annual.
And I think where an experienced business broker comes in, and typically most of the people on this podcast are business sellers and business buyers. An experienced broker can give strategies on how to best still capture that value, even though there's risk. And we're seeing a lot more sales have earnouts and retention, and there's various strategies. And even in smaller businesses now, we're starting to see a lot more of that structured sales scenario. So just to simplify that, instead of a client paying the full value today up front and paying a multiple of whatever it is, a multiple of 2 today, and then the buyer takes all the risk. Maybe the multiple's a 3 multiple, 2's paid today and 1's paid over a couple of years, where the vendor is now taking the risk for that number one customer, whether or not they stay. So we're seeing a lot more structured sales where a purchaser's willing to pay more because the risk has been moved.
How would you deal with a business, Steve, that's got illegal activity or they're just taking cash? How do you deal with that in your valuation?
So, yeah, it's a frustrating part of the business. So, look, and I think the best place to start on that, what the evidence shows you, there are still some businesses or some industries rather, more around the food industries, that there is still some cash, or for a better word, poor documentation. We don't know if there's cash, there's poor documentation. And what the evidence will show, those businesses typically get a lower multiple. From a sale perspective, they'll be sold by way of a trial, where the buyer will go into the business for a couple of weeks to assess it. But those multiples are at a lower multiple than if that client had proper documentation and had their records up to date. They'd get a much higher multiple. So that's what's typically happening.
So in all these valuations that you've done, what's the weirdest one you've come across?
The weirdest one was an adult business that had a fire. It was a court case, and I can't remember the details of the court case, but all the records had been burnt in the fire. And there was a diary with 3 months of hand notes in it. And we sought permission from the judge at the time to use that as our evidence to what revenue might have been and what profit might have been. So that was about the weirdest one.
So you based the valuation on that diary?
On A's, B's and C's and D's with ticks next to them for a 3-month period. But what we did, it is evidence, and we had to get permission that, this is the only basis that we can value this business because there are no records. So again, as a valuer, it comes back to what was the purpose. That was for a court case, and you've got to follow the rules of evidence very clearly.
So you mentioned earlier that in terms of businesses themselves, small businesses, they're becoming a little bit cleaner, a bit more structured. So I guess reading between the lines and the message that you've got is that if you've got a structured business, if you focus on keeping record keeping and documentation and things like that, you not only help the valuer and position your business better, but potentially the valuation will change with an uplift potentially.
Look, without a doubt, it's all business valuation, and purchasers are buying future revenue, future income. At the end of the day, that's why people are buying a business, whether it's to buy themselves a job, whether it's to buy themselves an investment. They're looking at future revenue. And what affects that is those risks. So all those issues we spoke about, leases, staffing, how can they assess all those areas if you don't have documentation? And what they'll do is they'll discount the business. They'll see it as a more risky investment or a more risky purchase, and it will affect your value. So the best advice for anyone looking at selling is get that documentation up to date. Don't be afraid to give it to the broker. Have it assessed, but every page of the lease, in years gone by, Bruce will remember, you'd ask for a copy of the lease and you'd get the front page. And that was all you got. we want every page. If there's 200 pages, we want the lot. And a good broker will go through and read every page and look for those problems. And it's not to discount the business. By the time we go and get the right buyer, the buyer will go through that lease and find these risk problems. And if you've dealt with it up front and found all the skeletons, you can put some strategies in place on how to deal with it.
Yeah. And often it's not just the lease. The deeper you dig, the more you'll find, there's a deed of amendment or a deed of assignment. There's other documents which could radically affect the value of the business. So getting one document enables you to dig deeper and get further in.
Part of the strategic, especially from a sale, not necessarily a valuation point of view, but from a selling point of view, things have changed. People are not willing to take the risk. There's plenty of options out there, and if they've got a choice of a couple of businesses, they'll pick the one that's easier. We tend to find that buyers' accountants are busier than they've ever been. So a buyer will take a business to their accountant, and the accountant will flick through 3 pages and just say, "No, I don't think that's a good fit for you. Move on," because he's busy. So the broker's role has changed a lot. We've got to basically, put everything on the silver platter for the purchaser's accountant and make it easy for the accountant to analyse the business and say, yes, you should buy this. It's perfect for you. But if we don't give them enough documentation, the accountant or the advisor, rather, for the purchaser is going to, just say, don't buy it, move on.
So essentially a good business broker prepares the buyer for due diligence from day one. Here's all the DD stuff. You just got to verify it.
100%.
So Steve, just for people's benefit, how long does it take from start to finish to get a valuation done?
Look, it depends, but typically most valuers, it will take 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, once they've got the documentation.
And when you've done the report, and do you just send it off to the client, or do you sit down and go through it with them, or how does that work?
I prefer to sit down and go through it. But again, depends on the circumstances. In a family law matter, for example, you don't go through it. But in a sale, look, as we said, the number's the number. So what sellers like to understand is what methodology. But what they really need to understand is what drove it. What were these factors that drove this business to be at the top end of the range or at the bottom end? What can you change? What strategies can we put in place to make sure you do get a sale? In some cases, businesses aren't sellable.
What happens when you get the report and you give it to the client and they're like, "Oh, that's way different to what we expected"? Have you ever found reason to change your report because of new evidence, or how does that work?
You would only change it if there was new evidence. And I can't think of circumstances where I've had to change, but maybe the client didn't understand what their responsibility was, and they hid some important documents. But I don't sign off on a report if I don't have what I'm after up front. I don't just make the assumptions. I sort of push a bit to make sure I get those documents up front before I sign off on them. But yeah, look, it's not uncommon for someone who may have been advised by their accountant, maybe another valuer, and hasn't, maybe was misinformed to, what's happening in the industry.
Yeah, right.
So one last question.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up in a minute. So this is the last one, Steve. You're finished after this. You're free.
The concept of, rushing. Are you finding that business owners that come to you for valuation, are they in a rushing stage? So as in they're desperate to sell, or do you find that people are planning the approach and they're thinking in advance?
Look, I think it's a responsibility of the valuer or the broker to set the expectations to how long this process is going to take.
Yeah.
There are plenty of brokers out there that will sign people up and give an appraisal on the back of a coaster and do it in 5 minutes and just get them on the market. And that's not the right approach. So I think, educating clients that, this is a process. You're going to achieve, a higher sale price if you do the preparation. And just walking them through and understanding that people's motivations are different. The motivation may be retirement, which is a simple one-word motivation, but when you dig down deeper, it's retirement because they have a serious illness. And again, from a timing point of view, that changes things. And this is not a valuer's hat on at the moment because that doesn't affect valuation. But from a broker's point of view, and the advice that we would give them, the strategy needs to be different. There needs to be a speedier strategy for that second circumstance. And, that's always, one of the hard parts as a broker because we are busy and we have a lot of conversations and motivations of people. If you don't dig down enough, and I've made this error before. Yes, retirement. Well, it's going to take X amount of time, but there's a serious health issue and they need it done quicker. So I think, having a good relationship with your client and being able to explain and helps. And the other thing to understand, there's nothing wrong from a purchaser's perspective of buying a business overvalued. Nothing wrong. If they understand what the business is worth and they understand the risks within the business, I've seen lots of transactions where they've overpaid for it because it's the perfect fit and it makes sense for them. It's a bit like when you bought your house. You're not going to let it go for, and miss out on that perfect house. It suits the family. It's in the right area. You'll pay a premium for that perfect fit. Well, the same for the vendor. In a circumstance where, the timing is just right, the purchaser has made an offer a little bit under market. If you understand what the real value was, you can make a decision that we will discount it to speed that process up. Yeah. So, knowledge is the key. Just understanding what that base range or base price is really helps you make those decisions. Is it worth hanging on for an extra year to get a premium that may or may not come, or take a quick sale because, it's reasonable.
Yeah.
And with having that information, the seller can decide, is it a share sale or an asset sale? How are we going to manage capital gains tax? How are we going to manage all those things that can actually affect what you walk away with?
Yeah, having those conversations with your accountant up front. So after you've got a valuation, and that's a good point, typically we're valuing the business. We're valuing it on the basis of market value. It's on the assumption the business essentially is an asset of the company. It's one part of that asset. It's not the whole company. So, however, some of these businesses we come across, we know when we value them, there is a good chance a purchaser may want to buy this as a share sale.
Yeah.
So you can then go off and have those conversations. How are we going to get that cash out of that company? How are we going to get it out? How do we deal with the taxes? And you can deal with that up front.
Yeah, it's much better than retrospectively or trying to deal with it when you got the offer on the table. So
if you can deal with that up front, and, even if there's only a 30% chance that it's share sale, getting the vendor to have those conversations with their accountant and say, look, this is what our business is worth. We're likely to get an offer around this, either higher or lower. How are we going to get the money out of the company in the event that it was a share sale? How should we structure this sale? And get that good advice up front.
Yeah, but the valuation enables them to do that.
Starting point.
Much more successfully. Are you working on any valuations at the moment, Steve?
Too many.
Well, we might let you go and get back to them then. So Thanks very much for having a chat to us today. We love, anyone watching this, or if you need a business valuation done, probably got to wait a couple of weeks. Steve Wray from Cornerstone CSBB in Sydney is one of Australia's leading business brokers and business valuers. So get on to Steve Wray, W-R-A-Y. So we might wrap it up there, Pete.
Fantastic. Well, Steve, Bruce, thank you as usual. And thank you to the listeners, the viewers for watching this video, for listening to the podcast. You can listen to our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts when you search Meaning Business Podcast. You can also watch our podcast on YouTube under youtube.com/Meaning Business. And make sure to like, follow, and stay tuned for more business episodes. And if you're watching this online, comment as well. And share your story, and have a fantastic day. Thank you for watching.
See you next time. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Pete.